Now, I knew I'd like Chay Bowes because I always liked him on screen. I didn't know I'd love him. He's an absolute oracle. This man knows everything there is to know, and he delivers it in such a delightful Irish accent. Chay Bowes joins me now, live in the studio in Moscow. Chay, welcome. You have been working non-stop on the square, talking about the parade, doing Moscow Mules, your regular show, and commenting everywhere with such, well, if I may say so, sagacity. For the viewers, sum up first before we get into what happens next. What was the meaning of the victory parade in Moscow this weekend?
Yeah, well, George, thanks for the kind comments. I mean, from the master, these are big plaudits.
No.
The meaning of this parade, I think you felt it, and you mentioned to me when we met after the parade that you might have shed a tear. Many people have said that to me. Russians, visitors, expats, people working here in the media. I think even the foreign media, by the lack of coverage and by how little they talked about the parade, you knew it was a huge success. So this was the 80th anniversary of what the Russians call, the Great Patriotic War, okay? And as I say in every commentary I give when I'm a correspondent on the square talking to an international audience, it's important that we explain to people how much of a living history this conflict is. Because there's not a person who marched on the square in front of us, there's not a person in the stands who doesn't have a family member or a familiar link or historical link in their village or town to somebody who was lost, a family that was devastated. The scale of the sacrifice of the Russian people as part of the Soviet Union, which was 15 republics, as you know, all which contributed, some of which were marching again on Red Square, the biggest parade since 2015. This was a momentous occasion. All of those peoples sacrificed an immense amount. It wasn't about communism. It wasn't about the Soviet Union. It was about the survival of a nation. And as the parade opens, it opens to an incredible piece of music, Sacred War. And it says, "Arise, great country, for a deadly fight." That's the opening chimes of this anthem. And it defined the Russian psyche, if you like, and that still lives on. And over the last 3 years that I've been living here full-time since the start of the military operation, I've watched the confidence of the Russian people evolve, if you like, particularly the younger people. And this parade seemed to be the pinnacle of a sea change in the attitude around, not being ashamed to be Russian, that they don't have to be somebody else, that they don't always have to look to the West for positive change. And that really, really struck me as tangible almost at the parade.
The international presence was also very impressive. Of course, the top honcho was Xi Jinping, the leader of the world's biggest country, but the president of Brazil was here, Vietnam was here, a lot of Africans were here, including the new hero, the new African Guevara, Captain Ibrahim Traore, that we have been talking about here on the show for quite some time now. It had a feeling about it that this was the Russia-China show with the global South gathering around them. It had a kind of changing of the guard feel about it to me. When you look in that train cabin I was talking about with the leaders of the other side, they look a tired and tawdry group, don't they?
It looks a bit jaded, is the term. Even the lighting, it all looks a bit grim.
Yeah.
And I think it smacks of desperation. The confidence that you and I saw, and it's very hard to relay that. As a correspondent, I'm trying to tell people about the noise, the cobbles actually shaking. Yeah. And it's not about military might, it's about confidence. And as I say again, this renewed confidence in Russia that we're winning. We're not just winning the military conflict, which nobody in Russia wanted. They didn't create this war, but they know it has to be fought and it had to be won in whatever format that victory comes, which I think it's going to come. And I think most Russians would agree. It's about the idea of Russia, this Ruski Mir, this idea that they understand now here in Russia, I think, that the Europeans are serious about trying to destroy Russia, to try to dismember it. They're openly saying that they want to carve Russia up into smaller states, that they want Russia's energy, they want Russia's vast natural resources, this continent landmass. It's a huge, huge country, as you know. It's a multi-ethnic country, so many time zones, so many languages. So the idea that this massive Leviathan is held together under this pressure, 55 countries, 16,000 sanctions, more to come, it seems to have inoculated not just the economy, but the society, that people are looking at each other saying, we can do this. We can win. We can win on the battlefield, but we can win in economy, and we can hold our society together. And I'd say that Vladimir Putin is probably more popular now. And I know people like Steve Rosenberg, who's constantly looking around in the bins of Moscow for something negative to say about this country, and his colleagues who were called to the Kremlin last night. I think they sense it too. They're finding it harder and harder to say negative things about Mr. Putin, who is an incredibly popular man. And that is to the great chagrin of people like Kaja Kallas, these very Russophobic people, whose only forward momentum seems to be carried by this anti-Russian energy. They only know what they don't want. They don't want Russia involved in international community. They don't want Russia in sport. They don't want the Russian language spoken. And that's defined by how easily they completely ignore human rights abuses in Ukraine, the abduction of people from the street. This is an open-air prison. It's a dictatorship, no elections. All of that is immediately discounted. And if there's a piece of litter on the ground in Red Square, this is on the front page, as you say. So I think there's an air of desperation. I think you saw that in this train carriage with these very unpopular people.
Every one of them unpopular.
Exceptionally unpopular.
Merz is not even in office yet, but only 23% of Germans.
The Merz magician, I'm calling him, because he strangely got re-elected. He wasn't elected, and Our Lady's elected. Yeah. Starmer, or the Starmer Führer, as I've coined the phrase. He's such a peculiarly...
Yeah. Macron's on 23%.
Unpopular man. And it's incredible. I think he's the most unpopular new prime minister in many, many decades. And there's money for war. There's money for these long-winded aspirations, thousand-year Reich with Ukraine. There's money for everything, but there's no money for the pensioners, the poor pensioners, the people who fought the Nazis, the people who saved Britain in the air, in the skies, on the seas. If they are unlucky enough to survive in today's Britain, they are denied a fuel allowance. Can you imagine the granular insult of that? My own grandfather was a fireman in London, as many Irish were in the Second World War. And, he was a great fan of the United Kingdom. He's an Irishman. He served in the fire service. He would have been so angry to see what's happened to the UK now. And I think what Starmer does is also, he diminishes and demeans the idea of socialism. That, we should have an anti-war movement in the UK led by Labour, greats like Tony Benn, greats like yourself. Where are these people? There's a vacuous hole now in the anti-war movement. Where is CND? Where is the calls for this insanity in Ukraine, which was manufactured, as you know, and protracted and propagated by really, really evil people in the State Department, in MI6, who are still desperate to cling on to the forward motion of escalation, as everybody else in the world realized that the war's already over. It's really who's going to say, look, it's over. The emperor has no clothes. When is that realization?
Who wants to be the last to die?
Who wants to be the last to die? And I think John Kerry said that about Vietnam very famously. He says, who's going to be the last man you ask to die for a mistake in Vietnam?
Now, whatever was fueling it, their braggadocio was quickly burst by Trump today. Mm-hmm. They claimed they had Trump's backing for a 30-day ceasefire as a precondition to negotiation. Trump came out fighting. Go to Istanbul on Thursday, he ordered Zelensky. Zelensky's got no choice but to go. Am I right?
100%. For all of the Western or the European coalition of the
coalition of it.
You're right, yeah. For all of their bluster and PR spin, they're terrified. I know people who work on the fringes of the European Union. I was in Brussels not so long ago and talking to a lot of people there, and they are absolutely terrified of having to take on the massive millstone that is Mr. Zelensky, the narco-Führer. They're terrified of it because they know a premature entry of Ukraine into the EU is the end of the EU. And then by default, probably the end of NATO as well. They're all in a panic mode. So they completely have no other plan other than escalation, but they're secretly happy when the big Don steps in and says, look, get over to Istanbul, go and reignite the talks that were started in 2022, very soon after the start of this, element of the conflict, because this conflict probably started in the aftermath of the Second World War, the cultivation of it.
Yeah.
With
I said
funding of
2014, but actually started in
with the
1945.
CIA, the Banderites, funding this aggressive Ukrainian nationalism in an attempt to destabilize the Ukrainian SSR, to pull it away from the Soviet Union, to exploit these ethno-nationalist links. It's an old playbook. So I think Trump stepping in, and it's very, as you say, it's refreshing, it's terrifying, but he is the cock of the walk. He does have the dollar, he does have the big army, and the Europeans know that among the entirety of NATO, from Washington to Istanbul, in 3 months, Russia makes more artillery shells, tanks, and heavy artillery equipment, guns, and military material than the whole of NATO does in an entire year. They know that it will take decades.
And no refrigerator or washing machine harmed.
Yeah, and we saw those refrigerators and washing machines 24 hours ago. They looked very intimidating.
Exactly.
And so they understand that. The reality is that NATO has been shown to be a paper tiger as well. There's so much political capital, financial capital, and as you say, braggadocio built into the very existence of the EU now and its military wing, NATO, that they know they have to try to reverse out of Ukraine in some sort of plausible way. And that will end, as it did in Vietnam, when the Vietnamese dictator was very conveniently killed in a coup d'etat, which 30 years later we learned that the CIA had managed that coup. So Mr. Zelensky's in a very difficult position. He's caught between radical nationalists in Azov, in Pravi sector, who've warned him publicly that they'll kill him if he concedes to give up territory. You've got the Americans who want their money back. They're knocking on the door. You've got the Europeans telling him that they're going to give him everything he needs, but giving him absolutely nothing. They can't even put together 15 or 20,000 troops to go into Ukraine. If those troops do come into Ukraine, the Russians, and Sergei Lavrov has very clearly said, if they step foot onto Ukrainian soil, we'll see them as combatants and we will hit them very hard. And we know the Russians have the capability to do that. So they're in a very difficult place right now. As the Big Don says, they just don't have the cards, George.
So what are Russia's terms in Istanbul, do you think? What would it take to get the ink on the paper that should have been on in 22 that Boris Johnson wrecked? What would it take now? Because, of course, a lot of blood and treasure has been expended between then and now. Russia's demands are presumably more onerous, which is what we kept advising the Ukraine. When you do eventually settle, it's going to be for much tougher terms than it would have been at the beginning. What will it take, do you think? I know you don't speak for the government, but just to educate our viewers, what do you think Russia will be demanding in Istanbul?
Well, if you are on the street in Russia, or any town in Russia, I've been all over this huge country, and the discussions are the same. There's a sense now that things have changed somewhat. At the start of the conflict, at this phase of the conflict, there was a sense that this is a brotherly nation. We don't want to go too hard. We don't want to hit them too hard. They're our own people. There's nobody in Russia who doesn't have a Ukrainian aunt or uncle or a grandparent. The names are everywhere. So there's a very hard to decide where Russia ends and Ukraine begins. Ukraine was essentially part of the old Russian Empire as well. Malorussia.
Kiev was the capital of Russia.
Kiev was the capital. It was the Kievan Rus. So, this Ukrainian language that people are speak in Ukraine was essentially a dialect of Russian. And, it means the edge, Ukraine. That means it's on the edge, borderland. So, there's been a lot of manufactured reality about it, just like our nationhood in Ireland was diminished and undermined as in the British Empire because it had to be. This was a lot of manufacturing. Crimea gifted to the Ukrainian SSR by Nikita Khrushchev. And I often say to people, "Oh, Crimea is Ukrainian." I say, "Well, was it Ukrainian in February 1954?" They say, "Of course it was." I say, "It actually wasn't. It was Russian." So there's an awful lot of ignorance, and that ignorance has to be cultivated. Okay, what the Russians now see is they see that they've got the capacity militarily, societally, and politically, and to stay the course. Because as we speak, incrementally, Russia is grinding down the Ukrainian military. They have no men left to fight. They have no military industrial complex. Every tank that the Ukrainians lose has to be replaced not from an indigenous military-industrial complex, which Russia has a huge military-industrial complex. I had tried to tell people how vast it is. Whole cities like Tula, like Ural-Vagonzavod, these massive, almost cities that produce tanks. Whole blast furnaces. The UK has one blast furnace, which is about to close. It's owned by the Chinese. Russia has at least 12 of them, and they run 24 hours a day. So this massive Soviet muscle memory has been re-energized into life, and it's only really kicking in now into its maximum productivity. And the West knows that. They can't win a land war against Russia. Russia has the most modern nuclear arsenal, the biggest nuclear arsenal, and it has the best and most deadly delivery system in Oreshnik, which we were told they were running out of missiles, they were using microwaves and dishwashers. Ursula told us this. And then suddenly the Oreshnik is seen, and we're told, oh, they've only got one or two of them. So what the Russians now have is a renewed confidence. And I think the sense in its sentence would be, it's basically, no deal is better than a bad deal now. There's people say we need to take Odessa, we need to take Kharkov, whereas people before were saying we just need to get this ended. But there is a sense now that, Ukraine is on the ropes. And as you've said, it's like the gladiator standing above the Russian gladiator standing above the Ukrainian gladiator, who looks up and says, I demand a 30-day ceasefire. I posted this today on my Twitter, on my X profile. It's just this remarkable detachment from reality that the vanquished essentially is demanding a ceasefire of the Russians, who are essentially in control on the battlefield. As you saw, geostrategically, they're in control in Russia, in Moscow. Over 20 leaders here from very important countries, not small countries. This wasn't Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. This was China, the Indians represented, Indonesia. These are powerhouses which many people in the West like to think don't have washing machines and microwaves, but they do. And this coalition, it's a coalition of confidence. And as you say, they're gathering under an umbrella, a Russian and Chinese umbrella, and that's given them renewed confidence. Like Mr. Traore coming to Moscow, he's under pressure, but he knows he has very big friends. So the Russians now know no deal is better than a bad deal. They're not going to be told to have a 30-day ceasefire, because the Ukrainians are desperate for a ceasefire, because they are getting wiped out, unfortunately, in a military sense, in places like Pokrovsk. They know they're finished there. But the Russians are very incrementally grinding forward. They'll negotiate while they advance. They won't stop. And I think what the Russians will want is the achievement of the goals of the special military operation, to deal with the fundamental issues that began this conflict. Denazification, which people laughed at in the West. Denazification, what is that? We all know what denazification is now, because we've seen the vastly disproportionate influence of Nazism and right-wing radical ideology on Ukrainian government. They want the legally Russian territories under their control, at the very least. And they want to know that their children won't have to fight this war again. This is something I repeatedly hear from taxi drivers, from politicians, from soldiers. We don't want our kids to have to do this again. So we're going to finish the job this time. And I think that's the sense now. I think there's going to have to be some very difficult discussions among the Ukrainians as to who do they serve, either Ursula von der Leyen and Mrs. Callas, or their own people. And I think it's going to be Mrs. von der Leyen, Mrs. Callas, because you can see Ukraine has become essentially a dictatorship, an open-air prison. So it's very interesting what will happen. But as far as the Russian ideas, I think they're growing in confidence. I think you can feel that being here.
Definitely.
That the confidence is growing, that we've got this, we can do this. And they know that the worst the Americans will do is say, look, okay, I'm out, because the big Don is prone to that. He might say, I'm out of here, deal with it yourself. He doesn't like Zelensky. He likes Mr. Putin. He sees him as a peer. He sees him as a man of great political capability and strategic nous. And he's right. Zelensky is what Zelensky is. He's not in charge of anything. And I think he's going to become more and more isolated in his own community. We see more and more politicians speaking out somewhat, even in the media. People are getting more critical of him. A man not elected since 2019.
No,
this is a dictatorship, a de facto dictatorship at the very best, you could call it. So I think we're in the end game. We're in the last quarter of the match, let's say. And the Russians are in no mood to sign a bad deal. They don't need to do it. They've got the capability to push this war forward. They don't want the war. Everyone wants the war over. As in every conflict, nobody sane wants the war. But they know no deal is better than a bad deal. And it's going to be very, very interesting what happens in Istanbul.